Welcome, everyone. This is the LaRouche Show. It's Saturday, November 13th, 2010. My name is Marcia Mary Baker, and in the course of the next hour, we're going to be discussing what you might best call the personage who is a puppet elect to the Senate from Kentucky, Rand Paul, the phenomenon, the person, the pedigree, the etiology, kind of a disease, and what really we must do in this country right now to flank the bastards, as Mr. Lyndon LaRouche has said. It's part of our job to flank these bastards and get the emergency action we need.
No.
Right. Well, Tony, you have the same experience when it comes to some of the people who might consider them as Tea Party leaders or the radio hosts or something. You know what I mean? They're the ones that are freaking out when you tell the truth, that Rand Paul and Obama have the same policies.
Right. I had a very intense experience yesterday. I was on Jack Blood's radio interview, and he began screaming and going hysterical when I pointed out very calmly that Rand Paul, having been elected supposedly to oppose Obama's killing off of the American population, has allied himself to Obama to kill Americans, not only to Obama but to George Soros on things like dope. And I very specifically pointed to a radio interview or TV interview that Rand Paul had a week ago, saying that he recommended the point of view of Chris Edwards at Cato Institute. That's an agency of the Austrian School, and we'll get to that. But Rand Paul said, you have to listen to this guy. He knows what we have to do. And Chris Edwards had recommended destroying NASA space program, destroying Medicare, destroying Social Security, and implementing the green agenda to stop the development of modern technology. So when I brought this up, that Rand Paul is simply a demagogue working for the global money power, and that he has allied himself, contrary to the public's wishes, with Obama, who's out to kill them, this radio host went insane, and he was shouting and screaming to prevent a reasoned and patient analysis of what the situation is that we face in this collapse, and with demagogues like Rand Paul running around.
Well, so, Tony, maybe you want to, and Alan, you could chime in too, but I'm asking Tony here, do you want to identify, most of the people who will be listening will know some of the exact same policies, like you said, kill NASA, cut Medicare. In fact, I think Rand Paul or this Chris Edwards or Cato or something wants to get rid of the Army Corps of Engineers. I mean, talk about demagoguery. This is really wild. But do you want to identify some of that?
I think to get a clear picture of what we're facing, you have to go to the level of the brainwashers, the people manipulating Rand Paul as he manipulates the population for them.
In other words, who's packaging this stuff?
Yeah, he's like a performer who's doing a job on behalf of people that are brainwashing him, and he in turn passes that brainwashing on to the public. And this is the so-called Austrian School.
Okay.
Now, this is a grouping or tendency, not a school or college, a tendency among economists that was set up between the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg family, and the British Empire in the late 19th century. And it was designed to counter the influence of America in the world and to try to destroy our republic. They deny that we live for a higher purpose, that human beings live for a higher purpose. And this is the traditional British focus on pain and pleasure as the only elements in economics. But our nation has a real historical mission, and that mission to uplift, to raise the people into power, industrial power, political power, and cultural power. That mission was, at the time of Lincoln and some leaders after that, was reaching out to all the nations of the world, particularly inside Europe, when this so-called Austrian School was created to destroy us and abort that mission. So you have to see that this is power. In other words, at the time, who are the Habsburgs? They are the rulers of a Central European empire that propped up the most Dark Ages elements within the Catholic Church, ruled the Church for a great deal of time, and actually brought the Inquisition in, that we Americans rebelled against in forming our country. But beyond that, we had in the 19th century, in reaction to the American success at building infrastructure, at using protectionist government to build steel mills, raising the living standards, and then we were spreading that to Germany, to Italy, to Ireland, to Japan, to Russia. In reaction to that, the enemy took essentially two steps. One step is to create a new liberalism beyond just the use of force in politics. And this was counter to the American ideals. This liberalism from Austria is generally described as pessimism. They introduced ugliness in art, ugliness in music, atonalism, trying to destroy the legacy of Beethoven. They introduced soulless psychology with Carl Jung and Freudian and other elements, specifically against the higher concepts of the Renaissance. And this Austrian School of Economics proclaimed that liberty or freedom is simply the freedom of people to do with their money whatever they want. There's no higher purpose. And this is intended to mask the most obvious strategic point that when they started this in 1870s and 80s, they were then, with the British, creating what we now identify as the world empire of the money power, particularly based in London and with the axis running into Wall Street. For example, the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg-run Austrian Empire, was completely intermarried with the Belgian royal family and with the British royal family through the Belgians. This is a three-way monarch family. And they were starting up at just that time a whole new set of imperial experiments, nightmare experiments. This grouping was running, for example, the Opium Wars in the second round of Opium Wars in China. They sent Maximilian, the son of the emperor, over to Mexico after he had been viceroy of Venice and learned some of their methods. The British invaded Mexico during our Civil War, tried to impose him as an emperor in Mexico, while the British invaded Canada to put pinchers on us. They set up a new hell in Central Africa called the Congo, which became the personal private property of King Leopold II of Belgium. This was the real emblem in the 19th and early 20th centuries of mass slaughter of Africans and of colonial subjects. The book Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad goes into this. They killed 20% of the people there to loot the minerals and so forth. But this gets us to the Austrian School. What is the Austrian School? In 1876, in response to the American breakout in developing our industry post-Lincoln. The Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, assigned a writer and political hack named Karl Menger, M-E-N-G-E-R, assigned him to be the tutor of Crown Prince Rudolf. And over the next few years, Menger took Crown Prince Rudolf of the Habsburg family around Europe and tried to explain to him the American menace in the world. Bismarck had just adopted the Americans, or was in that period right then adopting the American system. Protectionism, government interference against international trade cartels, government payment to build railroads like Lincoln did, against the money power of Britain and the continental bankers that were propping up these monarchs. And so he explained you have to have a new kind of liberalism to combat this. By 1881, which is 5 years later, Crown Prince Rudolf married the daughter of Leopold of Belgium, so that he became the heir of the Congo. And you have the Rothschilds and the Barings and other bankers that are propping these people up, moving into Africa, moving into other parts of the world, as they had been in China, looting and debauching and destroying. Look today at the American midday. We are in the middle of a collapse, a fundamental collapse of that empire that I'm talking about, the money power empire. And what Lyndon LaRouche is proposing is, which he has proposed since we started this movement in 1966, that we must take the power over world affairs away from that empire, away from the London Wall Street axis. Now it's a matter of life or death. So we're proposing to Glass-Steagall Act in, put a fire system, let Wall Street collapse without harming our banks, and go ahead with full-scale infrastructure development to save our people. Bail out the states and cities so that people aren't killed. Save Social Security and so forth. Build up wages with higher industry. What does Rand Paul propose? He comes in and he says that we need to cut Social Security. The people sponsoring him and the entourage appeals to the psychology of fear by saying, yes, we have a collapse. You can't really do anything about the money power. They're all powerful. So you should try to pleasure yourself with gold or with some private pistols and guns. Or better yet, why don't we start a movement to demand that other people besides us get killed off by the government? Poor people, for example, or black people, or whatever. So we'll eliminate, or elderly. We don't need our parents. Get rid of them. Obama proposed, putting the rationing on medical care by the government.
Why should elderly people have hip replacements?
Yeah, and Obama promised the insurance companies. I remember how this started. He promised the insurance companies he would cut $2 trillion out of medical care by killing off the elderly, essentially. That was Orszag's program. What was Orszag's other program that he's famous for? The budget director for Obama. Get rid of Social Security. So here comes along Rand Paul, when the public is disgusted with Obama killing grandmother, and Rand Paul says, I'm going to kill grandmother by taking away her Social Security. I'm going to kill grandmother by making sure that nobody has a job in the country and can support her and keep her alive. So this is a death-dealing man. And then you have another way to pleasure yourself for the populists, for this type of populist, the Cato, the libertarian Austrian school people, is to say, take dope. It's your right. And therefore, it is the right of the oligarchs, the bankers, to pour dope into our country, as they did to China, as they are doing to pay the terrorists in Afghanistan. finally, let me mention this. This is all based on systematic lying. The first lie is to deny that we're up against an oligarchy, that we're up against an empire. And if you deny that, then you can never solve the foreign wars that Rand Paul or other people like that claim they're against. The principle of terrorists being sponsored by this oligarchy goes back to what happened in Italy back in the time they set up this Austrian School. It's a very simple case. Italy was a bunch of small principalities, and there was a wonderful American allied man named Emilio Cavour, C-A-V-O-U-R, who unified Italy just at the time that Lincoln became president. The Austrians were in a war to stop him. They tortured people. They executed thousands of Italians to try to keep the rule of their empire over these Italian states. At the same time, the British had terrorists operating in Italy under the leadership of Mazzini, who lived in London. And they sent these terrorists out all over Europe. This is the two-fisted approach of the money power, of the imperialists, to try to stop the emergence of nation states that can protect their people. Every form of terrorism in the world today is of that covert operations type. There is no such thing as independent terrorists. If you want to dry out the terrorists, bring modern times to these areas and resume America's business of uplifting the world. Yeah, I'd like to get into the method, the sophistry inside this that is presented through Rand Paul by people like the late unlamented Friedrich von Hayek, who came from Austria to spread the garbage of Menger from out of the late crypts of the Austrian Empire. He went to the University of Chicago. Hayek came there after World War II. They had published his horrible book, The Road to Serfdom, where he calls for a world empire of really a world police force to stop nations from interfering with free trade. That's in his book published at the University of Chicago. But he was set up at that same time the bankers group called the Mont Pelerin Society. And this outlook at the University of Chicago, it's not all from Hayek, but it's all from that group of bankers. That is the spirit, the satanic spirit that governs Barack Obama's policy. That's what it's right from that University of Chicago gang of anti-American. This is a foreign enemy of the United States, and this is the same thing that Rand Paul subscribes to. Now let's look at his proposal. Hayek says that we are in favor of private property, and the state wants to take away your private property. What does he mean by private property? Well, there's a fun little historical fact that when that ship sailed into Boston Harbor and the colonists in rebellion took the tea off of there and threw it in the harbor, that tea and that ship belonged to the East India Company. And if you are not at war with that global empire represented by the East India Company, then you are, as Rand Paul is trying to put the tea back into that East India Company ship and reverse the Tea Party. But what do we mean by private property? According to somebody like Hayek, private property means that small cliques of and former landed aristocrats who are now in the modern world bankers or military men or priests or whatever, but in a clique like the British Privy Council, this money power, that they have the property of a whole other country, like India, like the Congo, or like the United States of America. That's their private property to determine our policies. In fact, actual private property is largely an American invention. That is, private property in the modern sense. We believe in private farms, family farms. We believed in family businesses. We believe in skilled workers who
like
have
machine shops like in Wisconsin, right?
Exactly right. And we want to have these things so that we have a skilled, scientific, educated, and cultured and informed population that can stand up against these foreign enemies that we're talking about. How did these forms of private property come into existence? Here, there were no such things as family farms in most of Europe. You had estates of the landed aristocracy, and most people were ignorant peasants and fools who home
Serfs,
at night
yeah.
and serfs, and they came home at night and beat their wives and drank themselves into a stupor and went off, took their children off in the morning to work throughout the day. That is not what we have. We have private property because it serves our purpose of uplifting mankind. That's our purpose. So this is the great lie of Hayek. And how did we develop this? We developed this with infrastructure, with large, effective infrastructure like railroads and canals, always built at government expense, always as a national program, whether it was officially federal or some other thing, but it was always at government expense. We also did this by protectionism, where our right to have manufacturing was accomplished, was successful, because our federal government stopped the import of cheap products that were dumped here by the British, sometimes when they did it losing money, only to try to crush our infant industries. So the big lie of Hayek is to try to, from the standpoint of an undead feudal banker aristocrat, to come here from another country and tell Americans that private property really means that Americans do not have the right to control their own government and to use the government against that money power. That's the essential argument here. And this is why when Rand Paul, for example, says he's against the Federal Reserve, fine. What was the Federal Reserve? It was the private preserve of the money power against what? Against the power of the government, at best with a national bank, to direct the credit of our country. Who's going to direct the investments? The government doesn't have to tell you in detail what to invest in, but they have to promote the direction of the investment into infrastructure, industry, farming, science, and so forth. Or you can rest assured that the economy will be destroyed by the money power sucking out all of the money, all the credit, to put it into speculation and war and devastation. Those are the only two choices. There's not the choice of saying, we'll leave it to every man to make the economic decisions about what's going to be invested in. That's a crock. That's completely out of history. The name Austrian School, this is another fun fact. The Austrian School, that name, was a term said in derisive laughter by Germans in the era of Bismarck, when the fools who copied Menger were saying that it's self-evident that only individuals and bankers have rights, nations have no rights, and without referring to any history at all. I mean, here's the history right in front of them, that in fact Americans, who had the most rights of all in the world, established those rights by building a powerful nation. If they didn't have the powerful nation with powerful industry and a powerful government, they would have had no rights at all. They would have been slaves and serfs in places like Europe or India or China or anywhere else that was under the rule of this empire. So that's the fact of history. And the whole idea of the Austrian School and the British-Austrian alliance that established it is that they deny history entirely.
Right, and they set up, one thing is just, they set up a lot of franchises, I guess you could say, over the last 100 years or so.
Important.
And you mentioned University of Chicago, Friedrich von Hayek. In other words, and you'd mentioned at the beginning, the Cato Institute, Rand Paul was referring to.
Freedom Works.
Okay, so they've set these up, in fact, all around the world in the last 50 years, right?
Yes.
Do you want to just mention a couple?
Yeah, there's the Adam, what's the name of this institute in England? It's the Central Hayekian Montpellerin.
I don't know. There's Atlas or Adam Smith.
Yeah, that's it. The Atlas, not Adam. The Atlas Foundation in England, and they sponsor various other think tanks and foundations to spread this poison, this foreign enemy poison, into the U.S., into all throughout the world. The Cato Institute, which talks a good game about liberty, says that the proper way of dealing with things like Social Security is to crush it like the dictator Pinochet crushed it down in Chile. And the fact is, as Keynes and all these people recognize, that their form of economics, which is to deny the right of a nation to rise, which is to give the right of the money power to do anything, to hold mankind at their pleasure and crush us, that this form of economics can only really be imposed by totally disorganizing a country, demoralizing a country, or imposed by force, as Hitler did. And that's why the Hitler mustache really belongs on both Obama and Rand Paul, whose principles are Satan's principles from this European foreign enemy. Unfortunately, it takes somebody who has a taste for and an experience with production and with what really goes into production to be able to competently stand up to these demagogues. Mm-hmm. And we're losing that capability. That's our precious heritage. People who could understand what's false when a demagogue like this hysterical radio guy yesterday throws at you, well, you're talking about socialism. You're for socialism. If you're not for Hayek, if you're not for the Austrian School, you're for socialism. And from this you get the propaganda started in the late 19th century attacking Lincoln as the big bogeyman of the Austrian School of Economics. They even have this guy, Thomas de Lorenzo, writing a book hilariously misnamed The Real Lincoln. And he's paid by the von Mises Institute of Alabama, the Klan element in Alabama. And this book says that Lincoln is a tyrant, that it was unfair for him to insist on preserving the Union, and that slavery would have peacefully disappeared if we could have destroyed the country somehow. If the country had been destroyed, then slavery would have just died away on its own. But take up this question of socialism. Socialism, one of in its worst forms. I'm not talking about some guy who believes in workers' rights and he's a laboring man and he's got vague ideas about these kind of things and he's for the government to do this and he thinks that's social. I'm talking about the organized movement, especially connected with Karl Marx, coming out of London and their satraps and overlapping with other forms of movements, the Mazzini and so forth. You have to distinguish that, which has no accomplishments whatsoever, from the accomplishments of nations, including nations that are putatively communist, like Russia and China. For example, China, when it was in the grip of the most insane form of socialism, namely Maoism, prescribed the takedown of real industry, that each person should make steel in his backyard. You don't need big steel mills. Whereas as a nation copied the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. They actually sent people here during World War II to study that, and they went back and eventually did a big a TVA-style dam, which is one of the most precious things done on this planet, the Three Gorges Dam. Control nature and stop flooding and save lives and generate electricity. So now, in our culture, with the military, for example, as part of our government, and protectionism and government credit and the agriculture department to give science to the farmers, these elements of government, we create success in the economy. Now, there is a difference. There's a fundamental difference between the way America has done this with our Constitution and the way, say, the Soviet Union or China or some other top-down dictatorship might have done things, which is on the question of creativity. We want individuals to be creative, to have a voice, and to be actually independent of the government and of any power controlling them. But that independence requires them to have culture and education. That's why we have public schools, if they're good. Right now they're rotten. But the idea, so this is where we differ. For example, somebody who has an empire could also have the power of that empire to build some sort of public works, whether it's a pyramid or something else, or whether it's some sort of collective agriculture or some steel mill or something, and try to use forced labor or minorities or something like that. Or Hitler built the Autobahn, right? That's a good example. The same kind of thing. Is that an accomplishment? In a sense, it is, but none of these things were invented by Hitler. He made rockets, but they were invented by people in an earlier era.
Yeah.
Science came from an earlier era. So America's Constitution promotes individual creativity protected by a powerful nation that has a strong central government that runs the credit of the country, not private foreign bankers. That's our elected government. That's our republic. And socialism is a crock. It's a mistake that was foisted on the world by the British and their Austrian and other friends to try to derail the American system. And he began screaming and going hysterical when I pointed out very calmly that Rand Paul, having been elected supposedly to oppose Obama's killing off of the American population, has allied himself to Obama to kill Americans, not only to Obama, but to George Soros on things like dope. And I very specifically pointed to a radio interview or TV interview that Rand Paul had a week ago, saying that he recommended the point of view of Chris Edwards at Cato Institute. That's an agency of the Austrian School, and we'll get to that. But Rand Paul said, you have to listen to this guy. He knows what we have to do. And Chris Edwards
same policies, like you said, kill NASA, cut Medicare. In fact, I think Rand Paul or this Chris Edwards or Cato or something wants to get rid of the Army Corps of Engineers. I mean, talk about demagoguery. This is really wild. But do you want to identify some of that?
I think to get a clear picture of what we're facing, you have to go to the level of the brainwashers, the people manipulating Rand Paul as he manipulates the population for them.
In other words, who's packaging this stuff?
Yeah, he's like a performer who's doing a job on behalf of people that are brainwashing him, and he in turn passes that brainwashing on to the public. And this is the so-called Austrian School.
Okay.
Now, this is a grouping or tendency, not a school or college, a tendency among economists that was set up between the Austrian Empire.
Welcome, everyone. This is the LaRouche Show. It's Saturday, November 13th, 2010. My name is Marcia Mary Baker, and in the course of the next hour, we're going to be discussing what you might best call the personage who is a puppet elect to the Senate from Kentucky, Rand Paul, the phenomenon, the person, the pedigree, the etiology, kind of a disease, and what really we must do in this country right now to flank the bastards, as Mr. Lyndon LaRouche has said. It's part of our job to flank these bastards and get the emergency action we need.
No.
Right. Well, Tony, you have the same experience when it comes to some of the people who might consider them as Tea Party leaders or the radio hosts or something. You know what I mean? They're the ones that are freaking out when you tell the truth, that Rand Paul and Obama have the same policies.
Right. I had a very intense experience yesterday. I was on Jack Blood's radio interview. Empire, Habsburgs, the Habsburg family, and the British Empire in the late 19th century. And it was designed to counter the influence of America in the world and to try to destroy our republic. They deny that we live for a higher purpose, that human beings live for a higher purpose. And this is the traditional British focus on pain and pleasure as the only elements in economics. But our nation has a real historical mission. And that mission to uplift, to raise the people into power, industrial power, political power, and cultural power. That mission was, at the time of Lincoln and some leaders after that, was reaching out to all the nations of the world, particularly inside Europe. When this so-called Austrian School was created, had recommended destroying NASA space program, destroying Medicare, destroying Social Security, and implementing the green agenda to stop the development of modern technology. So when I brought this up, that Rand Paul is simply a demagogue working for the global money power, and that he has allied himself, contrary to the public's wishes, with Obama, who's out to kill them, this radio host went insane, and he was shouting and screaming to prevent a reasoned and patient analysis of what the situation is that we face in this collapse, and with demagogues like Rand Paul running around.
Well, so, Tony, maybe you want to, and Alan, you could chime in too, but I'm asking Tony here, do you want to identify, most of the people who will be listening will know some of the exact